There has been some great and intense horror films in recent years, all having their strengths and weaknesses. But there's also been passable or downright boring horror films that fail to grab audiences' interest. But there is one non-horror film that I think a lot of horror directors can learn from. That film is Dunkirk. Dunkirk expresses so much in its visuals, characters and score, and allows them to feel like they are with the soldiers in their time of struggle. Their isolation from the rest of the world draws an ever-closing wall around them, making the beach their last and only hope of survival. The audience do get to breathe away this anxiety of entrapment when being introduced to the other stories, but once the action gets underway and each character is kept in their own confined space, it's very hard to find a moment to be calm. Alex Hess made this comment while talking about 2010's Buried. It's a film to which Alfred Hitchcock would raise a glass, a sucker for its self-imposed structures. His Rear Window, Rope, Lifeboat and Dial M for Murder all honour the idea that diminishing the space can ramp up the tension. Dunkirk prides itself on its locations, with all the characters as well as the audience being confined to a small area. A beach, a boat and a Spitfire. While the beach is bigger than the plane, there is still an overall sense of dread as the enemy could attack at any minute.
Why? Because we're outside the perimeter. Enemy could be right there.
This is a very close example of flipping Hitchcock's bomb theory on its head.
4 people are sitting around a table, talking about baseball, whatever you like. 5 minutes of it, very dull. Suddenly, a bomb goes off. Blows the people to smithereens. What do the audience have? 10 seconds of shock. Now take the same scene and tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information that in 5 minutes' time that bomb will go off. Now the conversation about baseball becomes very quiet. Because they're saying to you, don't be ridiculous, stop talking about baseball, there's a bomb under there.
Horror films want to show you more than the character. That's where their tension comes from. Mainly the killer or a ghost behind our protagonist's shoulder. But it's very easy for that to get old and bore the audiences because they've seen it countless times. Dunkirk doesn't allow the audience to see the enemy, and when they do turn up, they are out of focus and in the background. It keeps the audience and the characters with the same perspective. It creates an uncertainty in your head which ramps up the tension and keeps it up there for the duration of the film. The scariest things are the things we don't fully see or understand. That tension is what makes Dunkirk stand out, and if modern horror directors held back a bit and let the atmosphere of their films take over, we as an audience are right there with the characters. Film isn't a pantomime. We shouldn't need to think it's behind you, because it creates a disconnect between you and the film.
I wanted to try applying that very rigidly to the entire film so that we're creating an intensity of experience that accelerates from the audience and carries the audience forward in a way that hopefully they're not used to. And hopefully it's something that, without exhausting the audience, we're trying to destabilize the usual way of watching a film and the usual rhythms of watching a film.
So how does modern horror carry out tension? Really, it doesn't. Not compared to Dunkirk. They use tension to ramp up to jump scares, but after that initial scare, the tension fades until you see the next jump scare coming, and that repeats for the rest of the film. Jump scares do not scare, they startle. Being startled is not the same thing as being scared. Being startled is like getting pinched. The pain is sudden and sharp, but you forget about it immediately. Dunkirk grabs the audience in 2 main ways. The sound, mainly the score, gets the audience's attention at the very start with the use of a ticking pocket watch, telling the audience about the soldiers' limited time they have left. This harkens back to Hitchcock's theory in a soundtrack sense, counting down the hours until the 300,000 soldiers all perish. This ticking clock puts tension on everything our characters do, even if we haven't fully connected with them yet. With a lot of horror, there's always a massive build-up in the story, introducing characters, talking about the stakes, showing a tease of the stakes. It just gets boring because this describes so many modern horror films. Dunkirk raises the stakes in one shot. They then show the stakes a few seconds later, which forces our character to the beach where he is trapped. The audience are pushed into the film straight away, and then we are with him on that beach, wanting to get off just like him.
What I wound up doing was researching the history, getting the evacuation and the events of the evacuation sort of in my bones, if you like, kind of under my fingers. And then I created a fictional set of characters to guide the audience through the events. And I divided my telling of the story into 3 main strands, broadly speaking, land, sea, and air. And the reason I did this is I wanted to tell everything in a subjective way. I wanted the audience to have an incredibly suspenseful and intense experience and really feel that they're there on the beach, really feel that they're there in the cockpit of a Spitfire, really feel that they're on a boat coming over to help with the evacuation. So rather than cutting to generals in rooms or politicians explaining things, I wanted to stay with a human scale of storytelling, but use these different perspectives to gradually build up a larger picture of the events.
The only difficult part about applying Dunkirk's tension to modern horror is getting the mainstream audience to accept this new way of getting scared. This is shown with the response to It Comes at Night by mainstream audiences. The film has a slow pace, which allows the audience to become tense as they are sucked into the atmosphere of the film. Unfortunately, mainstream audiences just want the same thing, repeatedly, and this isn't a recent phenomenon. The late 70s and early 80s saw the rise of slasher films like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. Classics all, but movies whose structures lent themselves to easy imitation. Studios latched onto this low-hanging fruit and saturated market, producing upward of 80 slasher films in the 1980s alone. The mainstream audiences want more of the same cliché slasher or ghost films, purely for nostalgia, and studios won't change because they make money. But as we are heading into a post-modern horror era of film, I think these films can benefit more by taking Dunkirk and stripping it down to the bare bones. Constant tension, limited dialogue, and a distressing atmosphere that allows the audience to be there with the characters and not shout, "It's behind you," because I guarantee you, it'll be a much more rich and scary experience.